The wind tore across the moor with a sound like a scream, and Eleanor Whitmore gripped the leash so tightly her knuckles turned white. Pip, her small brown lapdog, had gone rigid in her arms, every hair on his back standing up. Something was moving through the fog ahead of them, something large, and Eleanor's heart began to pound before she could even see what it was. She had walked this path 100 times. She knew every twist of the trail, every leaning stone, every place where the heather grew thick enough to hide a rabbit. But she had never heard a sound like the one now rolling toward her through the mist, low and deep, like distant thunder given breath. Pip broke from her arms before she could stop him. He hit the ground running, this ridiculous fluffy little dog who weighed barely more than a loaf of bread, and he charged straight into the fog with his tiny legs pumping and his bark cracking through the wet air like a whip. Eleanor screamed his name and ran after him, her boots slipping on the wet grass, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Pip, Pip, come back." The fog swallowed her voice. She could see nothing but gray shapes and the dark shadow of the hills. Then, all at once, the mist parted just enough for her to see the outline of an enormous animal standing on the path, taller than any dog she had ever seen, its shoulders as high as her waist, its coat rough and gray. A wolfhound, and in front of it, absurdly, standing his tiny ground, was Pip, barking with everything he had. "No, no, no," Eleanor whispered, and she ran faster. She reached the two dogs, just as the wolfhound lowered its great head to sniff at Pip, who did not back down even an inch. Instead, he barked louder, spinning in a tight circle, his whole small body trembling with the effort of sounding fierce. Eleanor scooped him up before the wolfhound could do anything at all, clutching him to her chest, and only then did she look up to see the dog's owner. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed, taller than any man in her village, with broad shoulders wrapped in a plain brown coat that had clearly seen years of wear. His dark hair was damp from the mist and pushed back from his face without any care for how it looked. He had the kind of face that belonged on a farmer or a soldier, weathered and strong, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he laughed more than he frowned. He was watching her with an expression of open amusement, and Eleanor felt her face grow hot with embarrassment. "I am so sorry," she said quickly. "He has never done that before. I don't know what came over him." The man crouched down and rested a hand on his wolfhound's head, and the great dog immediately calmed, sitting back on its haunches as though nothing at all unusual had happened. "There is no need to apologize," he said. His voice was low and warm, with none of the sharp edges she expected from a stranger. "Boru here has faced down bulls twice his size, and barely blinked. I think your little friend may have given him more of a fright than the other way around." Eleanor looked down at Pip, who was still growling softly, his small body puffed up as though he had just won a great battle. "He thinks he is much bigger than he is," she said, unable to keep the smile from her voice. "It is a constant problem." "It is a fine quality in anyone," the man said, straightening back to his full height. "Confidence rarely comes measured out to match one's actual size." Eleanor found herself studying him more closely than she should have. His clothes were plain but well made, the kind of coat a gentleman farmer might wear, or perhaps the steward of some large estate. His boots were caked in mud from the moor, and there was nothing about him, not a single thing, that suggested wealth or position, and yet something in the way he stood, easy and unhurried, as though he had never once in his life worried about being late for anything, made her wonder. "I don't believe I have seen you on this path before," she said. "I know most of the families who walk here." "I am new to the area," he said. "Or rather, returning to it after a long time away. I used to know this moor rather well as a boy." "Then you will find it has not changed at all," Eleanor said. "It never does. That is either its great charm or its great failing, depending on how you feel about surprises." He laughed at that, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and the sound of it seemed to chase away some of the gray chill in the air. "I happen to be very fond of surprises," he said, "though I confess I did not expect one quite this small and quite this loud today." Pip, as though he understood he was being discussed, gave one more sharp bark in the wolfhound's direction, before finally settling into Eleanor's arms with an air of great satisfaction, as though he had personally driven off an invading army. "May I ask your name?" the man said, "since it seems our two companions have already made their introductions, however roughly." "Eleanor," she said, "Eleanor Whitmore. My father is the vicar in the village, just beyond the hill." Something flickered across the man's face at that, something quick and unreadable, gone before she could name it. "A vicar's daughter," he said. "That explains the kindness in how you scolded your dog. Most people would have shouted a great deal more." "Oh, I shouted plenty," Eleanor said. "You simply did not hear it over the wind." "And your name?" she asked, when he did not offer it. He hesitated for the briefest moment, so brief she almost missed it, and then he said, "Alistair. Just Alistair, for now." It was an odd way to introduce oneself, and Eleanor noticed it, filed it away somewhere in the back of her mind, the way she filed away odd turns of phrase in her father's sermons, without quite knowing what to do with them yet. But there was nothing threatening in his manner, nothing that made her want to hurry away, so she let the strangeness of it pass. "Well, Alistair," she said, "I hope Boru has recovered from his encounter with the fiercest dog on the moor." "He may need several days to recover his pride," Alistair said gravely, though his eyes were bright with laughter. "But I think he will manage." The fog was beginning to thin now, the wind pushing it back over the far hills, and Eleanor could see the shape of the whole moor spreading out around them, brown and green and endless, the kind of view that had always made her feel both very small and very free at the same time. She realized she had been standing there, talking to a stranger for several minutes, and yet it did not feel strange at all. It felt, oddly, like the most natural conversation she had had in weeks. "I should get back," she said, though some small part of her did not want to. "My father will worry if I am gone too long, especially with weather like this." "Of course," Alistair said, "though I hope our paths might cross again. I intend to be walking this way often, now that I am back." "The moor belongs to everyone who dares to walk it," Eleanor said. "I make no promises, but I imagine you will find me here more mornings than not." He smiled at that, a real smile that reached all the way to his eyes, and something about it made Eleanor's chest feel strangely warm, despite the cold wind. "Then I shall look forward to it," he said. "Good day, Miss Whitmore. And good day to you as well, fierce warrior," he added, nodding at Pip, who thumped his tail against Eleanor's arm, as though he understood every word. Eleanor turned and began walking back the way she had come, and it was only after several minutes that she realized she had not looked back to see if he was still watching her. When she finally did glance over her shoulder, the fog had closed in again, and there was no sign of the tall stranger or his enormous dog, as though the whole encounter had been nothing more than a dream conjured by the mist. But Pip was still trembling with pride in her arms, and her heart was still beating a little faster than the walk alone could explain, and Eleanor knew it had been very real indeed. She walked home slowly, turning the strange meeting over and over in her mind. There had been something about the way Alistair carried himself, something that did not quite match the plainness of his coat or the mud on his boots. He spoke like a man who had been educated somewhere far grander than any school in their small corner of the country. His hands, she recalled now, had been smooth, despite the roughness of his coat sleeves, not the hands of a man who spent his days working the land. Perhaps he was a steward for one of the great houses nearby, she thought. Perhaps he managed the land for some lord who never bothered to visit it himself. That would explain the fine dog, the good boots beneath the mud, the easy confidence. It made a tidy enough explanation, and Eleanor decided to be satisfied with it, at least for now. By the time she reached the small stone cottage where she lived with her father, the fog had lifted almost entirely, and pale sunlight was breaking through the clouds in long golden streaks. Her father, Reverend Whitmore, was in the garden trimming the hedges, his sleeves rolled up despite the cold, humming some old hymn under his breath. "You were gone longer than usual," he said, not looking up from his work. "I was beginning to think the moor had swallowed you whole." "Pip found a friend," Eleanor said, setting the little dog down on the garden path, where he immediately trotted off to investigate a beetle with great seriousness, as though the encounter with the wolfhound had never happened. "A friend," her father repeated, glancing up now with curiosity in his eyes. "What sort of friend?" "A very large one," Eleanor said, "belonging to a man I had never met before. He said his name was Alistair, and that he had returned to the area after a long absence." Her father's eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing more, returning his attention to the hedges. Eleanor knew that look. It was the look he wore whenever he was thinking something through carefully before he decided whether to share it. She waited a moment, but when he offered nothing further, she let the matter drop and went inside to warm herself by the fire. That evening, as she sat by the window, With her needlework forgotten in her lap, Eleanor found her thoughts drifting back to the moor, to the sound of that great deep growl rolling through the fog, to the sight of tiny Pip standing his ground against a creature 10 times his size. She found herself smiling at the memory, and then smiling again at the memory of Alistair's laugh, low and warm, and entirely unbothered by the ridiculousness of the whole situation. She told herself it meant nothing. Strangers passed through the village and the surrounding countryside all the time, drawn by business with the great estate that sat somewhere beyond the hills, though she had never once seen its owner, a duke whose name was spoken with a strange mixture of respect and distance by everyone in the village, as though he were more legend than man. Perhaps Alistair was connected to that household in some way. It would explain his sudden appearance, and his talk of returning after time away. Whatever the reason, Eleanor found herself looking forward to her morning walk, in a way she had not in a very long time, and when she finally went to bed that night, it was with the strange, fluttering hope that the moor might once again produce its unexpected visitor, and that Pip, brave, foolish little Pip, might once again decide to defend his territory against a dog 3 times his size. The wind picked up outside her window as she drifted toward sleep, carrying with it the distant sound of something that might have been an owl, or might have been, if she let her imagination wander just a little further, the deep and steady breathing of a great gray wolfhound somewhere out on the dark and endless moor. She woke before dawn the next morning, which was unusual for her, and lay in bed for a long while, listening to the quiet of the house and the soft patter of Pip's paws as he paced near her door, eager for their walk. She dressed quickly, pulling on her warmest cloak against the chill that always settled over the moor before the sun had properly risen, and made her way downstairs. Her father was already awake, seated at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a look of quiet contemplation on his face. "You are up early," he said. "I could not sleep," Eleanor admitted. "The wind was restless all night." "The wind is always restless on that moor," her father said. "It has been that way since I was a boy. There are those in the village who say it carries voices, though I have never put much stock in such tales." Eleanor smiled and kissed the top of his head before gathering Pip's leash from its hook by the door. "I shall be back before the morning service," she said. "Give my regards to your large-hearted little friend," her father called after her, and Eleanor laughed as she stepped out into the cold morning air, Pip trotting eagerly at her side, his small tail wagging with an energy that suggested he, too, was hoping the moor might hold another surprise. The path was quiet at first, the moor still wrapped in the pale gray light of early morning, the heather glistening with dew that had not yet burned away. Eleanor walked slowly, savoring the quiet, listening to the distant call of a curlew, somewhere out over the hills. Pip trotted along beside her, occasionally darting off to investigate some interesting smell before hurrying back to her side, and for a long while it seemed that this morning would be an ordinary one after all. Then, cresting the small rise where the path bent toward the old stone bridge, Eleanor saw him. Alistair was standing near the bridge, his wolfhound lying calmly at his feet, and he was looking out over the moor with an expression that Eleanor could only describe as wistful, as though he were seeing something in the landscape that no one else could see. He had not yet noticed her approach, and for a moment, Eleanor simply watched him, struck again by how out of place he seemed, despite how comfortable he looked standing there, as though the moor itself had shaped itself around him, rather than the other way around. Pip noticed the wolfhound before Eleanor could say anything, and this time, instead of charging forward with his usual bravado, he trotted ahead at a more measured pace, his tail wagging with something like recognition, as though the 2 dogs had already come to some private understanding the day before. Alistair turned at the sound of Pip's approach, and his face broke into a smile, so immediate and so genuine that Eleanor felt her own heart lift in response, before she had even said a word. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I confess I had hoped, rather than expected, that you might walk this way again so soon." "The moor called to me," Eleanor said, coming to stand beside him near the bridge. Or perhaps it was simply that Pip refused to let me sleep past dawn. I suspect he was eager to renew his acquaintance with Boru. As if to prove her point, Pip trotted directly up to the great wolfhound and sat down beside him, with an air of complete confidence, as though they had been the best of friends for years, rather than having growled at each other across a foggy path only a day before. Boru lowered his massive head and gave Pip a single gentle sniff, and the little dog's tail thumped happily against the ground. "It seems the fierce warrior has decided to make peace," Alistair said, watching the two dogs with clear amusement. "He does that," Eleanor said. "He is all bark and very little else. I think he simply enjoys the drama of the confrontation, more than any actual desire for battle." "A sensible philosophy," Alistair said. "Much can be gained through the appearance of ferocity, without any of the actual risk or unpleasantness of real conflict." Eleanor glanced at him curiously. There was something in the way he said it, something that suggested he was speaking from more experience than a simple observation about dogs would require. But before she could ask what he meant, he had already turned the conversation elsewhere. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore, do you walk this path every morning, rain or shine?" "Nearly every morning," Eleanor said. "It is the one part of my day that belongs entirely to myself. My father says I have inherited my grandmother's restlessness, though I prefer to think of it as a simple love of fresh air. I think there is nothing wrong with wanting something that belongs entirely to oneself," Alistair said, and there was a quiet weight to the words that made Eleanor look at him more closely. "It is rarer than people realize." They stood together near the bridge for a long while, talking of small things, the weather, the birds that nested in the old stone walls, the strange shapes the mist sometimes made over the far hills at dawn. Eleanor found that conversation with him came easily, more easily than it did with most people she had known her whole life, and she wondered at that even as she enjoyed it. The sun was fully risen by the time she finally excused herself, mindful of the morning service and her father's expectations, and as she turned to go, Alistair fell into step beside her without seeming to think twice about it, walking her a short distance along the path before their ways parted. "Until tomorrow, perhaps," he said, as they reached the fork where his path led toward the hills and hers led back toward the village. "Until tomorrow," Eleanor agreed, and she found herself smiling the entire walk home, unable to explain, even to herself, why a single conversation with a stranger on the moor had left her feeling so unaccountably light, as though something important had shifted quietly into place, without her quite noticing it happen. The days that followed fell into a pattern that Eleanor found herself treasuring more than she was willing to admit, even to herself. Each morning she rose before the sun had fully cleared the hills, dressed quickly, and set out across the moor, with Pip trotting eagerly at her heels, and each morning, without fail, she found Alistair waiting somewhere along the path, sometimes near the stone bridge, sometimes closer to the old churchyard wall, once even sitting on a flat rock near the crossing where the stream ran fastest, tossing a stick for Boru to fetch. It became, without either of them ever saying so directly, an arrangement. Not a formal one, not one either of them would have dared name aloud, but an understanding all the same, the kind that grows quietly between two people who find they would rather share their mornings than spend them alone. "You are here again," Eleanor said one morning, finding him seated on the low wall near the churchyard. Boru sprawled contentedly in the grass beside him. "I could say the very same to you," Alistair replied, rising to greet her with that same easy smile that had begun to feel, in the space of only a few days, entirely familiar. "Though I suppose between the two of us, I have less excuse. You have a home nearby. I am simply a man who has developed a habit of walking wherever he thinks he might find good company." "And have you found it?" Eleanor asked, unable to keep the teasing note from her voice. "Every single morning," he said, and something in the directness of his answer made her look away, suddenly conscious of the warmth rising in her cheeks. Pip, sensing no need to stand on ceremony, had already bounded over to Boru and flopped down beside the great hound with the easy familiarity of an old friend, and the two dogs lay together in companionable silence while their owners continued their own conversation nearby. "Tell me about your father's sermons," Alistair said, as they began to walk together along the path that wound past the old bridge. "I imagine a vicar's daughter hears more of them than most." "More than I sometimes wish," Eleanor admitted with a laugh. "Though in truth, my father is a gentle man in his preaching. He does not believe in frightening people toward goodness. He says fear makes poor soil for anything lasting to grow in." "A wise philosophy," Alistair said thoughtfully. "I have known men who believed the opposite, who thought fear was the only tool worth using, on animals, on servants, on entire households. I have never found it produced anything but resentment dressed up as obedience. There was something in his tone again, that same weight she had noticed before, as though his words carried the shadow of experiences he had not yet chosen to share. Eleanor wanted to ask more, but something in his expression told her the door had only opened a crack, and pressing too hard might close it again entirely. Instead she asked, "And what of your own family? You have mentioned returning after a long absence, but you have said very little else." Alistair was quiet for a moment, watching the path ahead of them, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, in a manner that struck Eleanor as oddly formal for a man dressed so plainly. "My family is complicated," he said finally. "There was a great deal expected of me from a very young age, more than I think most children should have to carry. I spent many years away, partly by choice, and partly because it was easier to breathe with some distance between myself and those expectations." "That sounds lonely," Eleanor said softly. "It was," Alistair admitted, "though I did not always recognize it as loneliness at the time. I simply thought it was the way things were meant to be. It was only recently that I began to understand how much I had been missing. Ordinary things, simple conversations, mornings spent walking without any particular purpose except the walking itself." Eleanor considered this, turning the words over carefully, sensing that he had given her something honest and unguarded, something that deserved to be treated with care rather than curiosity. "Then I am glad the Moor has given you that, at least," she said. "Even if only for a little while." "So am I," Alistair said, and when he glanced at her, there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch slightly, something warm and searching, that she did not quite know how to name. They walked on in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of their boots against the damp earth, and the occasional happy bark from Pip, who had taken to racing ahead and then doubling back, as though supervising the entire expedition. "May I ask you something rather forward?" Alistair said eventually, breaking the silence. "You may ask," Eleanor said, "though I reserve the right not to answer." "Fair enough," he said, smiling. "Do you ever dream of a life beyond this village? I do not mean that as any insult to it. I have grown rather fond of this corner of the country, in the short time I have been back. But you strike me as someone with a mind too curious to be entirely content within such a small circle." Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering, aware that it deserved more than a quick or careless response. "I have dreamed of it," she admitted. "There have been nights I have lain awake, imagining cities I have only read about, conversations with people who might challenge me in ways the village never has. But I have also come to love this place in ways I did not expect. My father needs me here, and there is a kind of peace in the moor, in the rhythm of the seasons, that I am not certain I would find anywhere else. Perhaps it does not have to be one or the other," Alistair said quietly. "Perhaps a person can carry both within them, a love of home, and a hunger for something more, without either one canceling out the other." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, and found herself smiling at the thought. They reached the fork in the path, where their ways typically parted, but this morning, for the first time, Alistair hesitated before turning toward the hills. "Might I ask you something else?" he said, "something rather less philosophical." "You may certainly try," Eleanor said, amused by his sudden formality. "There is a ball," he said, "at the estate beyond the hills. I understand invitations have gone out to families in the village, including, I would imagine, your father's." Eleanor's eyebrows rose in surprise. She had heard whispers of the ball, of course, everyone in the village had, but she had assumed it to be one of those grand affairs meant for people far above her own modest station, a courtesy invitation extended to keep the local families content, rather than a genuine expectation of attendance. "I had heard something of it," she said carefully, "though I confess, I had not given it much thought. Such gatherings are not usually the sort of thing I enjoy." "And why not?" Alistair asked, and there was something almost eager in the question that Eleanor found puzzling. "I find large gatherings rather exhausting," she admitted. "All that careful conversation, all those calculated smiles. I much prefer mornings like this one, honestly, where I do not have to think about what I am supposed to say next." "I understand that feeling more than you might imagine," Alistair said, and there was a strange flicker of something in his expression, something that looked almost like guilt, though it passed so quickly Eleanor could not be certain she had seen it at all. "Still, I find myself hoping you might attend. I think you would find it more interesting than you expect." "That is a bold claim, from someone I met only days ago, while my dog was attempting to fight yours, Eleanor said, though she softened the words with a smile. I have been told I am occasionally bold, Alistair said, though rarely without good reason. Will you consider it, at least? Eleanor studied him for a long moment, curious about the intensity behind his request, wondering what stake a man who claimed no particular connection to the great house could possibly have in whether a vicar's daughter attended its ball. But there was something so genuine in the way he asked, something so free of the usual games men played when they wanted something from a woman, that she found herself softening despite her reservations. I will consider it, she said finally, though I make no promises. That is all I ask, Alistair said, and the relief in his voice was so evident that Eleanor could not help but laugh. You seem unusually invested in my attendance at a ball hosted by people I have never met, she said. Should I be suspicious of your motives? Only if you are the suspicious type, Alistair said, and there was a teasing lightness in his voice that did not entirely mask the seriousness underneath it. I simply think you would enjoy yourself more than you expect, and I would very much like the chance to see you somewhere other than a foggy moor at dawn. The words settled over Eleanor, with a warmth she had not expected, and for a moment she found herself entirely without a clever response, which was, she realized with some surprise, a rare occurrence for her. Well, she said finally, gathering herself, perhaps I shall surprise you then. I have found, Alistair said, his eyes bright with something that looked very much like happiness, that you have a talent for that already. They parted ways at the fork, Alistair heading toward the hills, with Boru bounding ahead of him, and Eleanor turning back toward the village, with Pip trotting contentedly at her side. But her thoughts remained on the moor long after her feet had carried her home, turning over every word of the conversation, every strange flicker of expression she had noticed crossing Alistair's face, every unanswered question about who exactly this man was, and why his connection to the grand estate beyond the hills seemed to matter to him so very much. That evening, over a quiet supper with her father, Eleanor found herself mentioning the ball, almost before she had decided to. There is talk of a ball at the estate, she said, stirring her soup absently. I understand invitations have gone out to several families in the village. Her father looked up with interest. Yes, I received one myself, addressed to our household. I had assumed you would have little interest in attending, given your usual feelings about such gatherings. I had assumed the same, Eleanor admitted, though I find myself reconsidering. Her father set down his spoon and studied her with the careful attention he reserved for matters he considered important, though he said nothing for a long moment. This reconsideration would not, by any chance, have anything to do with your new friend on the moor. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm despite herself. He mentioned it, she admitted. He seemed to think I would enjoy myself. Did he? Her father said, and there was something careful in his tone, something that made Eleanor look up sharply. You disapprove, she said. I neither approve nor disapprove, her father said gently. I simply find myself curious about a man who appears from nowhere, claims no family name, and yet seems remarkably interested in whether the vicar's daughter attends a ball at the grandest house for miles around. It strikes me as the sort of curiosity a father is entitled to. He has been nothing but kind, Eleanor said, more defensively than she intended. I do not doubt that, her father said. Kindness is easy to offer and difficult to fake convincingly over many days. I only ask that you keep your eyes as open as your heart, my dear. That is all any father could reasonably ask. Eleanor considered his words long after supper had ended, long after she had retired to her room and settled beneath her blankets with Pip curled against her side. There was wisdom in what her father had said, she knew that much, and yet she could not quite make herself feel the wariness he seemed to want her to feel. Whatever mystery surrounded Alistair, whatever unexplained gaps existed in the story he had offered her, there had been nothing in his manner, nothing in the warmth of his laughter, or the gentleness in his eyes, that suggested anything but honest, uncomplicated affection. Still, as she drifted toward sleep, she found herself wondering, for the first time with any real seriousness, exactly who Alistair truly was, and why a man with no family name to offer seemed to carry himself with the quiet, unshakable confidence of someone who had never once in his life needed to prove himself to anyone at all. News traveled quickly in a village as small as theirs, and by the end of that week, It seemed there was hardly a soul who had not heard some version of the story, each one slightly more embellished than the last. Eleanor first became aware of just how far the whispers had spread when her friend Margaret Colby appeared at the cottage door on a bright, blustery afternoon, her cheeks pink from the walk, and her eyes practically glowing with the eagerness of someone bursting to share news. "You will not believe what I have heard," Margaret announced, barely waiting for Eleanor to step aside and let her in. "Then perhaps you should sit down before you tell me," Eleanor said, amused despite herself, gesturing toward the chair by the fire. Margaret sat, though she seemed far too animated to stay still for long. "They say the Duke himself has returned to the estate," she said, practically whispering the words, as though they were dangerous to speak aloud. "In secret. No grand carriage, no announcement, nothing. Old Mrs. Hargrove swears she saw a tall gentleman riding through the far fields nearly a fortnight ago, dressed as plainly as a farmhand, and she is certain it was him." Eleanor felt something small and cold settle in her stomach, though she could not have said exactly why. "The Duke has never once visited in all the years I can remember," she said carefully. "Why would he suddenly appear now, and in disguise of all things?" "No one knows," Margaret said, clearly delighted by the mystery of it all. "Some say he has come to inspect the estate, without his usual attendants fussing over him. Others say he is hiding from some scandal in the city. My mother thinks he has come looking for a wife, quietly, so that no fortune hunters descend upon him the moment word gets out." Eleanor laughed, though the sound came out a touch more strained than she intended. "That sounds like the sort of story invented by people with far too much time, and far too little to occupy their imaginations." "Perhaps," Margaret said, though her eyes narrowed with sudden shrewdness. "And yet you have not once smiled since I mentioned the tall gentleman dressed as a farmhand. I would have thought a vicar's daughter, so devoted to matters of truth, would find the whole tale rather amusing." "I do find it amusing," Eleanor said quickly, perhaps too quickly. Margaret studied her for a long moment, and then a slow, knowing smile spread across her face. "Eleanor Whitmore," she said, "you have been positively glowing every time you return from your morning walks this past week. Do not think I have not noticed." "I have been glowing because the weather has finally turned pleasant," Eleanor said, though even to her own ears, the excuse sounded thin. "The weather," Margaret repeated flatly. "I see. And does the weather have a name? Does the weather happen to own an enormous gray dog and walk the moor at dawn?" Eleanor felt her cheeks flush hot, and she busied herself with the teapot, rather than meet her friend's knowing gaze. "His name is Alistair," she admitted finally, unable to maintain the pretense any longer. "He is new to the area. We have simply fallen into the habit of walking the same paths at the same hours. That is all." "That is all," Margaret repeated, clearly not believing a word of it. "Eleanor, you have known this man for barely a week, and already you cannot mention the weather without your voice changing. What do you know of him? Truly, where does he come from? What is his family?" "He has told me very little of his family," Eleanor admitted. "Only that it was complicated, and that he spent many years away from it." "That tells you nothing at all," Margaret said, though not unkindly. "I know," Eleanor said, "and yet somehow, it does not trouble me the way I think it ought to." Margaret leaned forward, her earlier teasing giving way to something gentler, more genuinely concerned. "I only worry for you," she said. "A man who offers no name, no family, no clear position, appearing suddenly, at the very same time as all this talk of the Duke in disguise. It seems a strange coincidence, does it not?" Eleanor had wondered the very same thing herself, more than once, in the quiet hours of the night, when sleep would not come easily. But something in her resisted the idea entirely. Some stubborn instinct that refused to believe the easy, warm, unguarded man she had come to know on the moor could possibly be connected to a figure as distant and untouchable as the Duke. A man whose name was spoken in the village, with the same hushed reverence reserved for kings in old stories. Someone who had never once, in all the years Eleanor had lived there, set foot among the ordinary people, whose lives his estate quietly governed. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "that if Alistair were truly the Duke, he would have very little reason to spend his mornings tramping through mud and mist, simply to talk with a vicar's daughter about hedgerows and curlews. Surely a Duke would have grander things to occupy his time." "Perhaps," Margaret said, though she did not sound entirely convinced. "Or perhaps a Duke, tired of grander things, might find exactly that sort of ordinary conversation more appealing than anything else in the world. The words lingered with Eleanor long after Margaret had finished her tea and departed, promising to return with any further gossip that might reach her ears. Eleanor sat by the fire for a long while afterward, Pip curled contentedly in her lap, turning the conversation over in her mind again and again. She thought of the smoothness of Alistair's hands beneath the roughness of his coat sleeves. She thought of the careful, measured way he spoke, as though every word had been considered before it was offered, a habit she had noticed in her father's more educated visitors, but rarely among ordinary village folk. She thought of the way Boru, his enormous wolfhound, seemed to obey him, with an ease and devotion that suggested years of careful training, the kind of training that required considerable resources and time. And she thought, too, of that strange flicker of guilt she had seen cross his face when he asked her to attend the ball, a flicker she had dismissed at the time but which now seemed to carry new weight. And yet, even weighing all of this evidence honestly against itself, Eleanor could not bring herself to believe it. It felt, somehow, too neat a story, too much like something from one of the novels she sometimes borrowed from the small circulating library in the next village over, where poor but clever young women always discovered that their mysterious admirers were secretly wealthy lords in disguise. Real life, she reminded herself firmly, rarely arranged itself so conveniently. The next morning, she set out for her walk, with these thoughts still circling in her mind, and she found Alistair waiting near the old stone bridge, as he so often did now, tossing a stick into the stream for Boru to fetch with great enthusiasm. "You seem troubled this morning," Alistair observed, the moment she drew close enough for him to read her expression. "Is everything well?" Eleanor hesitated, uncertain whether to voice the question that had been circling her mind since the previous afternoon. But something in his open, concerned expression convinced her that honesty, however awkward, would serve them both better than pretense. "There is talk in the village," she said carefully, "that the Duke has returned to his estate in secret, disguised as an ordinary man." Something crossed Alistair's face then, quick and complicated, and Eleanor watched it carefully, trying to read whatever truth might be hidden beneath his expression. But whatever it was, he mastered it quickly, offering her a smile that seemed, to her searching eyes, just slightly too careful. "Village gossip does love a good story," he said lightly, "especially one involving dukes and disguises. I imagine half the countryside is convinced of some grand romantic tale by now." "Margaret certainly seems convinced," Eleanor said, watching him closely. "She has taken to wondering whether you might be connected to the estate somehow, given your sudden appearance, and your reluctance to discuss your family." "And what do you think?" Alistair asked, and there was something careful in the question, something that suggested her answer mattered to him a great deal more than the casual tone of his voice let on. Eleanor considered her words carefully before answering. "I think," she said slowly, "that if you were truly the Duke, hiding behind a plain coat and a borrowed name, you would have very little reason to spend your mornings walking with a vicar's daughter, rather than attending to whatever grand business a duke must attend to. It seems, to me, a rather elaborate deception for very little reward." Something flickered across Alistair's face again, quicker this time, and Eleanor could not tell if it was relief or something closer to guilt. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "the reward is greater than you imagine." The words hung between them, strange and weighted, and Eleanor felt her heart quicken despite her best efforts to remain composed. "What do you mean by that?" she asked. But Alistair only shook his head, offering her a smile that seemed determined to lighten the sudden heaviness of the conversation. "I only mean," he said, "that a man tired of grand business might find far greater reward in an ordinary morning spent in good company than in anything his position could otherwise offer him, that is all." It was not, Eleanor felt certain, entirely all. But she recognized, too, the careful way he had steered the conversation away from a direct answer, and something in her decided not to press further. Not yet. Not while the morning remained so peaceful and the company so pleasant. They walked together for the remainder of the hour, speaking of lighter things, though Eleanor noticed that Alistair seemed slightly more subdued than usual, his laughter a touch more careful, his gaze occasionally drifting toward the distant hills where the great estate lay hidden beyond the rise, as though some private worry had settled over him that he was unwilling to name. When they parted at the familiar fork in the path, Alistair caught her hand briefly before she could turn away, his grip warm and gentle. "Eleanor," he said, and something in the way he said her name, without any title, without any formality, made her breath catch. Whatever you hear from the village, whatever stories reach your ears in the coming days, I hope you will remember that the man who walks this moor with you each morning has been entirely honest about the things that matter most. That is a strange thing to say, Eleanor said softly, searching his face for some clue to his meaning. Perhaps, Alistair said, but I hope you will remember it all the same. He released her hand then, and turned toward the hills, Boru bounding ahead of him, and Eleanor stood watching him go for a long while, Pip sitting quietly beside her, until the mist rolled in once more and swallowed him from view entirely, leaving her alone with her thoughts and a question that seemed, with each passing day, to grow more urgent and more difficult to ignore. The formal invitation arrived at the Whitmore cottage on a gray Thursday morning, carried by a young footman in livery so fine that half the village turned out simply to watch him walk down the lane. Eleanor's father accepted the sealed letter with careful hands, and once the footman had departed, he broke the wax seal and read its contents aloud at the breakfast table, his eyebrows rising slightly with each line. It seems, he said, setting the letter down, that we are formally and specifically invited to the ball at the estate, not merely included among the general village invitation, mind you, but named directly, both of us, by title and name. Eleanor frowned, taking the letter from her father's hands to read it herself. The paper was thick and expensive, the handwriting elegant and confident, and there, in careful ink, were both their names, Reverend Edmund Whitmore and Miss Eleanor Whitmore, invited by name to attend the ball hosted by the household of the estate beyond the hills. That is unusual, is it not? Eleanor said slowly, a strange unease beginning to stir in her chest. I thought such invitations were extended generally to respectable families in the area, not to particular individuals. It is unusual indeed, her father said, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. I cannot recall the last time our household received a personal invitation to anything at that estate. In all my years as vicar here, I have exchanged perhaps a handful of polite words with the Duke's steward, and never once with the Duke himself. Eleanor read the letter again, searching the elegant handwriting for some clue, though of course there was nothing to be found there beyond ordinary formal language. And yet the unease in her chest only grew heavier as she considered the timing of it all, arriving so soon after her conversation with Alistair, so soon after his strange insistence that she attend, so soon after Margaret's teasing suspicions about a duke in disguise. She said nothing of her thoughts to her father, not yet, uncertain herself what to make of the strange coincidence, and instead busied herself with the practical matters of preparing for such an occasion. There was, after all, the small matter of what she would wear, a concern that occupied a good portion of her attention over the following days, as she and Margaret pored over the modest contents of her wardrobe, searching for something suitable for an event so far beyond the ordinary gatherings they usually attended. You must wear the blue, Margaret declared firmly, holding up the dress in question, a simple, but well-made gown Eleanor had worn only twice before, once to a wedding, and once to a Christmas gathering. It brings out the color of your eyes wonderfully, and it is elegant enough, without appearing, as though you are trying too hard to impress anyone. I am not trying to impress anyone, Eleanor said, though the protest sounded weak, even to her own ears. Margaret raised an eyebrow but said nothing further on the matter, and Eleanor was grateful for her restraint, uncertain she could have offered any convincing defense had her friend pressed the point. The days leading up to the ball passed in a strange blur of anticipation and nerves unlike anything Eleanor had experienced before. Her morning walks continued as always, and Alistair remained waiting for her each day, warm and attentive as ever, though Eleanor noticed a certain restlessness in him now, a quality she had not seen in their earlier meetings. He seemed, at times, on the verge of saying something important, only to pull back at the last moment, redirecting the conversation towards safer, lighter topics. You seem distracted, Eleanor observed one morning, as they walked along the stream where Boru had taken to chasing dragonflies with great enthusiasm, despite never once catching one. Do I? Alistair said, though his tone suggested he knew exactly what she meant, and was choosing his words carefully. I suppose I have a great deal on my mind these days. Anything you would care to share? Eleanor asked, watching him closely. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Eleanor began to wonder if he would answer at all. "There is something I have been meaning to tell you," he said finally, his voice unusually careful. "Something I fear may change how you see me, once you know it." Eleanor's heart quickened, though whether from hope or apprehension, she could not have said. "You may tell me anything," she said softly. "I do not think there is much that could change how I have come to see you these past weeks." Alistair looked at her then, something raw and uncertain flickering across his face, and for a moment, Eleanor thought he might finally speak whatever truth he had been carrying so carefully hidden. But then something shifted in his expression, a kind of resolve settling over him, and he shook his head slightly. "Not yet," he said quietly. "Let me tell you at the ball. I think it is better said there than here, on a foggy path, where I cannot properly see your face when I say it." Eleanor wanted to press him further, wanted to demand he explain himself immediately, rather than leave her waiting in uncertainty. But something in his expression, some quiet plea for patience, convinced her to let the matter rest, at least for now. "Very well," she said. "I shall hold you to that promise." "I have never broken a promise to you," Alistair said, "and I do not intend to start now." The remainder of their walk passed more lightly, though Eleanor found her thoughts returning again and again to his strange words, to the fear in his voice when he spoke of changing how she saw him. She thought of Margaret's suspicions, of the personal invitation addressed to her by name, of the smoothness of his hands, and the easy authority with which he carried himself despite his plain clothing. And slowly, carefully, a suspicion began to take shape in her mind that she could no longer entirely dismiss, however much she wished to. That evening, unable to settle her thoughts, Eleanor sought out her father in his study, where he sat reading by candlelight, his spectacles perched low on his nose. "Father," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk, "may I ask you something rather strange?" "You may ask me anything, my dear," he said, setting down his book with the patient attention he always offered her. "Do you think it possible," she said slowly, "that Alistair might be connected to the estate in some greater way than he has admitted? That he might in fact be the very man the whole village has been whispering about?" Her father studied her for a long moment before answering, his expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. "I have wondered the same thing myself," he admitted finally. "There is something about the manner of a man raised to expect obedience that cannot be entirely disguised by plain clothing, however well chosen. I have noticed it in the way he carries himself, though I have said nothing of it to you before now, not wishing to plant suspicion where none may be warranted." "And what would it mean?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "if it were true? If he has been hiding something so significant from me all this time?" Her father considered the question carefully before answering. "It would mean," he said gently, "that he has been afraid, my dear. Afraid of exactly the kind of change he mentioned to you. The fear that once you knew the truth of his position, you might see him differently, might treat him with the same careful distance that surely surrounds him in every other part of his life. It is not so difficult to understand, even if it has not been entirely fair to you." Eleanor sat with this thought for a long while, turning it over carefully, weighing her own feelings against the uncertainty of what the coming ball might reveal. She thought of every moment they had shared these past weeks, every conversation, every unguarded laugh, every quiet, honest confession he had offered her about loneliness and expectation, and the hunger for something ordinary and real. None of it had felt false. None of it had felt like performance. Whatever secret he carried, she found she could not bring herself to believe it had poisoned the genuine warmth of everything else between them. "I do not know what I will feel," she admitted finally, "when I learn the truth, whatever it may be. But I know that I have come to care for the man I have walked with these past weeks, whoever he may truly be, beneath his plain coat and his careful silences." "Then hold on to that," her father said gently. "Whatever you learn at the ball, a person's true character is rarely found in their title or their circumstances, but in the small, ordinary kindnesses they choose to offer when no one requires them to. And from everything you have told me, this Alistair of yours has offered you a great many of those." Eleanor left her father's study that night, with her heart still unsettled, but somehow steadier than before, comforted by his words, even as the mystery of Alistair's true identity continued to press against the edges of her thoughts. The ball was now only days away, and whatever truth waited for her there, she found herself resolved to meet it with as much grace and courage as she could gather. The final days before the ball passed in a whirlwind of preparation, fittings, and nervous anticipation. Each morning walk on the moor carrying a new weight of unspoken questions between herself and Alistair. Both of them aware, it seemed, that something significant was approaching. Something that would either confirm or shatter the careful, tender thing that had grown between them over these past weeks of fog and quiet conversation, and two dogs who had somehow, against all expectation, become the very best of friends. In the days that remained before the ball, something shifted between Eleanor and Alistair, a deepening that neither of them named aloud, but both clearly felt, as though the unspoken secret hovering between them had, paradoxically, drawn them closer rather than pushing them apart. Their morning walks grew longer, stretching sometimes past an hour, sometimes past two, until Eleanor found herself hurrying home breathlessly, worried her father would begin to wonder what exactly kept her so long upon the moor. It was on one such extended walk, beneath a sky heavy with the promise of rain that had not yet fallen, that Alistair finally began to speak more openly of the childhood he had kept so carefully guarded until now. "I grew up in a large house," he said, as they walked slowly along a stretch of path lined with gorse bushes, just beginning to bud. "Larger than any place has a right to be, filled with servants, who addressed me with careful formality, even when I was barely old enough to walk properly on my own. My father believed firmly that affection weakened character, and so he offered very little of it, reserving his attention mainly for lessons in duty and responsibility." "That sounds terribly lonely," Eleanor said softly, matching her pace to his as he spoke. "It was," Alistair admitted, "though I did not always recognize it as loneliness. I thought, for many years, that this was simply how all children of consequence were raised, distant from their parents, surrounded by tutors and expectations rather than warmth. It was only when I was sent away to school and met boys from families quite different from my own, families who wrote them letters full of small, silly affections, that I began to understand what I had been missing." Eleanor listened carefully, aware of how rare it was for him to speak so openly, and unwilling to interrupt the fragile honesty of the moment with questions that might close the door again. "My mother died when I was young," Alistair continued, his voice quieter now. "I remember very little of her, only fragments, the smell of a particular soap she favored, the sound of her humming, somewhere down a long hallway. My father remarried eventually, though the woman he chose had little interest in a stepson who was not her own, and so I largely raised myself, with the help of a groundskeeper who taught me more about kindness in a single afternoon of fishing than my own family managed in years." "Is that why you love the moor so much?" Eleanor asked. "Because it reminds you of him?" Something flickered across Alistair's face, surprise perhaps, at how readily she had understood something he had not entirely realized himself. "Perhaps," he said slowly. "I had not thought of it in quite those terms, but perhaps you are right. He used to bring me out to walk these very hills when I was a boy, before I was sent away, before everything became so complicated with duty and expectation. I think some part of me has been trying to find my way back to that feeling ever since." Eleanor reached out then, without entirely deciding to, and took his hand in hers, a small gesture, but one that seemed to carry enormous weight in the quiet of the moment. Alistair looked down at their joined hands, with an expression of such genuine surprise and gratitude, that Eleanor felt something in her chest tighten with tenderness. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for listening without judgment. I have told very few people any of this." "Why me?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. "You have known me only a few weeks. Surely there are others in your life you have known far longer, people better positioned to understand the weight of what you carry." Alistair considered the question seriously before answering. "Because you have never once looked at me the way everyone else in my life looks at me," he said. "Even now, not knowing everything you deserve to know, you have listened to me as though my words matter, simply because I am the one speaking them, not because of any title or position attached to my name. I cannot tell you how rare that has become in my life, or how much I have come to treasure it." The rain finally began to fall then, light at first, scattering across the heather in soft patters, and they took shelter beneath a wide, gnarled tree that stood alone near the edge of the path, its branches offering just enough cover to keep the worst of the weather at bay. Baru and Pip curled together near their feet, entirely unbothered by the rain, while Eleanor and Alistair stood close together beneath the sheltering branches, their earlier conversation still hanging warm and heavy in the air between them. I have something to confess as well, Eleanor said, finding courage in the intimacy of the moment. I have been given a match by my father, or rather, encouraged toward one. Mr. Fenwick, the solicitor's son from the next village. He is a perfectly respectable man, kind enough in his own way, and my father believes he would make a suitable husband. Alistair's expression tightened slightly at this news, though he said nothing at first, simply waiting for her to continue. I have resisted the match, Eleanor continued, though I have not entirely explained why, even to myself, until recently. I think I always assumed I would eventually accept. That duty would win out over whatever quiet dissatisfaction I felt about the arrangement. But these past weeks have made me realize how much I have been settling for less than what I truly want, simply because I did not believe anything better was available to someone in my position. And now? Alistair asked, his voice carefully controlled, though Eleanor could hear the tension beneath it. Now I find myself far less willing to settle, Eleanor said honestly, meeting his eyes, despite the vulnerability of the admission. I find myself wanting something that feels real, something built on honest conversation, rather than convenient arrangement. I did not expect to find that on a foggy moor, with a man who will not tell me his family name, but I have found it all the same, and I am not certain I know how to walk away from it now, even if duty demands that I should. Alistair reached up then, and gently brushed a strand of rain-damp hair from her face, his touch tender and careful, as though she were something precious he was afraid of damaging through carelessness. I do not want you to walk away from it, he said quietly. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. My title, my land, my influence, my name. You have wanted nothing from me, except honest conversation and quiet company, and I cannot tell you what that has meant to me these past weeks. Then tell me who you truly are, Eleanor said softly, the question finally escaping her lips after weeks of careful restraint. Whatever secret you have been carrying, I would rather hear it from your own lips than continue guessing at shadows. Alistair was quiet for a long moment, the rain pattering softly against the leaves above them, and Eleanor could see the internal struggle playing out across his face, the desire to finally speak the truth warring against some deep, ingrained fear of what that truth might cost him. At the ball, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, I promise you, Eleanor, at the ball you will know everything. I only ask that you trust me a little longer. Trust that whatever you learn does not change the truth of everything I have told you these past weeks, everything I have felt in your company. Eleanor searched his face for a long moment, weighing the sincerity she found there, against the frustration of continued uncertainty, and finally she nodded slowly. Very well, she said. I will trust you a little longer. But I hope you understand how difficult that trust has become to maintain, not knowing even the most basic truth of who I have been walking beside all these weeks. I understand completely, Alistair said, and I am more grateful for your patience than words can properly express. The rain began to ease then, the clouds thinning slightly to let pale sunlight filter through, and they emerged from beneath the sheltering tree to continue their walk. Though something had shifted between them now, some new fragility layered atop the growing tenderness, as though both of them understood that whatever waited at the ball would either deepen everything they had built these past weeks, or shatter it entirely. As they finally reached the fork in the path where their ways parted, Alistair turned to her one last time, his expression unusually solemn. Whatever happens at the ball, he said, whatever you learn about me, I want you to know that everything I have felt these past weeks has been entirely real. I have not once pretended to feel something I did not feel, whatever else I may have withheld from you. I believe you, Eleanor said softly, and found, to her own surprise, that she truly did. He pressed a gentle kiss to the back of her hand before releasing it, a gesture so formal and yet so tender that it left Eleanor's heart racing, long after he had disappeared into the mist toward the hills. Boru bounding faithfully at his side, leaving her standing alone on the path, with Pip pressed warmly against her ankles, and 1,000 unanswered questions still circling restlessly through her mind. The morning of the ball arrived gray and blustery, with clouds racing swiftly across the sky, as though even the weather could not decide how the evening ought to unfold. Eleanor woke early, though not nearly early enough to satisfy the nervous energy that had settled into her stomach the moment she opened her eyes, and she spent the hours before the carriage arrived pacing between her bedroom window and the small mirror in the hallway, checking and rechecking her appearance, with an anxiety that Margaret, arriving to help with the final preparations, found both amusing and touching. "You have checked that mirror at least a dozen times," Margaret observed, carefully pinning a final strand of Eleanor's hair into place. "Anyone would think you were preparing to meet royalty." Eleanor said nothing to this, though the words landed with more weight than Margaret likely intended, given the suspicions that had grown steadily heavier in Eleanor's mind over the past days. She had not walked the moor that morning, unwilling to risk seeing Alistair before the evening, wanting instead to preserve whatever fragile mystery remained, until the moment he had promised to finally explain himself. "You look beautiful," Margaret said softly, stepping back to admire her handiwork. The blue gown fit Eleanor perfectly, simple in its design but elegant in its cut, and her dark hair had been arranged with just enough care to look effortless rather than overdone. "Whoever this mysterious man of yours turns out to be, he will not be able to look away from you tonight." "I am not entirely certain that is a comforting thought," Eleanor admitted, smoothing the fabric of her skirt with nervous hands. The carriage arrived precisely at the appointed hour, sent by the estate itself, a detail that struck Eleanor as unusual enough to deepen her already considerable unease. Her father, dressed in his best clothes for the occasion, offered her his arm as they climbed inside, and the journey toward the great house passed in a blur of nervous silence, both of them lost in their own private thoughts as the carriage rattled along the winding road that led toward the hills. The estate itself, when it finally came into view, took Eleanor's breath away, despite every effort to remain composed. She had glimpsed it from a distance many times over the years, a grand stone structure rising from the landscape like something out of an old story, but she had never before approached it so closely, never seen the way its windows blazed with warm golden light against the darkening evening sky, never heard the distant strains of music drifting out across the grounds to greet arriving guests. Inside, the grand hall overwhelmed her senses entirely, chandeliers dripping with candlelight, walls hung with portraits of solemn ancestors, and a crowd of finely dressed guests already gathered, their voices blending into a low, constant murmur beneath the music of a small orchestra tucked into one corner of the room. Eleanor felt suddenly, acutely aware of how small and out of place she must appear amid such grandeur, and she found herself gripping her father's arm, a little tighter than necessary. "You belong here as much as anyone," her father murmured, seeming to sense her distress. "Never forget that, my dear." They moved through the crowd slowly, exchanging polite greetings with familiar faces from the village, though Eleanor found her eyes constantly scanning the room, searching for any sign of Alistair among the sea of unfamiliar faces. She did not see him, not in the first hour, not even as the evening wore on and the dancing began in earnest, couples moving gracefully across the polished floor, while she stood near the edge of the room, her nervousness slowly curdling into something closer to disappointment. "Perhaps he could not come after all," Margaret suggested gently, finding Eleanor near one of the tall windows overlooking the darkened grounds. "Perhaps whatever business kept him occupied these past weeks has called him away again." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, though the word felt hollow in her mouth, and she found herself fighting against a growing sense of foolishness, wondering if she had allowed herself to build an entire fantasy around a man who had, in the end, simply disappeared, as quietly and mysteriously as he had first appeared. It was then, as the orchestra paused between pieces and a hush fell briefly over the crowded room, that a sudden shift in the atmosphere caught Eleanor's attention, a subtle but unmistakable change in the energy of the gathered guests, heads turning toward the grand staircase at the far end of the hall, voices dropping to whispers, and Eleanor turned along with everyone else, her heart beginning to pound with an instinct she could not yet name. A footman's voice rang out clear and formal across the suddenly silent room. "His Grace, the Duke." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she watched a figure descend the grand staircase, tall and composed, dressed in the finest evening clothes she had ever seen. Dark fabric that fit him with the precision only a master tailor could achieve, his dark hair combed back neatly from a face that Eleanor recognized instantly, despite every difference in dress and setting, despite every desperate hope that her eyes were somehow deceiving her. It was Alistair. The crowd parted before him as he reached the base of the staircase, bowing heads and murmured greetings following in his wake, and Eleanor stood frozen near the window, her hand gripping the sill so tightly her knuckles had gone white, as every piece of the puzzle she had been assembling for weeks finally clicked into place, with devastating clarity. He was the Duke. He had always been the Duke. Every morning on the moor, every gentle laugh, every careful confession about loneliness and expectation, all of it had come from the same man, now standing at the center of this grand hall, accepting the deference of an entire room with the easy, practiced grace of someone who had been trained to it since birth. Eleanor felt something hot and sharp rise in her chest, humiliation tangled together with a hurt so deep it nearly stole the breath from her lungs entirely. She thought of every conversation, every moment of vulnerability she had shared with him, believing herself to be speaking with an ordinary man, rather than the most powerful figure for miles around, and the realization that she had been, in some fundamental way, deceived throughout the entire acquaintance, left her feeling suddenly, desperately foolish. Across the room, Alistair's eyes found hers, and Eleanor watched as his expression shifted from the practiced formality he had been wearing moments before to something far more urgent, far more anxious, as he clearly registered the shock and hurt written plainly across her face. He began moving through the crowd toward her, murmuring quick apologies to those who tried to catch his attention, his focus entirely fixed on reaching her before she could disappear. "Eleanor," he said, finally reaching her side, his voice low and urgent beneath the resuming music of the orchestra. "Please, let me explain." "You are the Duke," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with an effort to keep it steady. "All this time, every conversation, every walk, and you never once thought to mention something so significant. I wanted to tell you," Alistair said, reaching for her hand, though she pulled it back before he could take it. "I have wanted to tell you since our very first meeting, but I was afraid, Eleanor, afraid that the moment you knew, everything between us would change, that you would begin treating me the way everyone else does, with careful distance and calculated words, rather than the honest warmth you have offered me these past weeks. That was not your choice to make for me," Eleanor said, her voice rising slightly, despite her efforts to keep the conversation private amid the crowded room. "You allowed me to believe I was speaking with an ordinary man, sharing confidences I would not have shared so freely had I known the truth. That is not honesty, Alistair, whatever your reasons. That is deception, however gently intended." Several nearby guests had begun to notice the tension of their exchange, curious glances drifting their way despite Alistair's attempts to keep his voice low, and Eleanor felt suddenly, overwhelmingly aware of how exposed she had become, standing in the middle of this grand hall, humiliated before an entire room of strangers, who surely already suspected far more about her private walks upon the moor than she would have liked. "I need air," she said abruptly, and before Alistair could respond, she turned and made her way quickly toward the nearest door, her father's concerned voice calling after her, lost somewhere in the crowd, her only thought to escape the suffocating weight of the room and the devastating truth that had just been revealed to her in front of everyone she knew. The cool night air hit Eleanor's face like a splash of cold water the moment she stepped through the tall doors leading out onto the estate's sprawling garden terrace, and she gulped it down gratefully, willing her racing heart to slow, willing the hot press of tears behind her eyes to recede. Before they could fall in front of the assembled guests, she could still hear murmuring behind her through the open doors. The garden stretched out before her in the darkness, illuminated only by scattered lanterns hung along the stone pathways, casting soft pools of golden light amid the shadows of carefully tended hedges and rose bushes just beginning to bloom. Eleanor moved further into the darkness, away from the light spilling out from the ballroom windows, needing distance, needing space to gather herself before she could face anyone again, whether Alistair or her own father, or the curious eyes of the village families, who had surely already begun whispering about the scene they had just witnessed. She heard his footsteps behind her, before she heard his voice, quick and purposeful against the gravel path, and she turned to find Alistair following her into the garden, his formal jacket removed at some point, his shirt sleeves rolled up in a manner that suddenly, painfully, reminded her of the plain, unassuming man she had first met on the foggy moor weeks ago. "Please," he said, stopping a respectful distance away, clearly reading the anger and hurt still evident in her posture. "Give me the chance to explain properly, away from all those watching eyes." "I do not know what explanation could possibly make this feel any less like betrayal," Eleanor said, her voice sharper than she intended, though she found she could not soften it, not with the humiliation of the ballroom still burning fresh in her memory. "I never lied to you," Alistair said carefully. "Not once, in all our conversations. I simply never spoke my full name, never mentioned my title. Everything else, every feeling, every confession, all of it was entirely true. An omission this significant is its own kind of lie," Eleanor said. "You allowed me to believe things about our conversation, about the nature of what was passing between us, that were fundamentally untrue. I spoke to you as I would speak to an equal, shared thoughts and fears I would never have shared so openly, with a man who holds such power over this entire region. Had I known Alistair, everything would have been different." "That is precisely why I did not tell you," Alistair said, his voice gaining a desperate edge now. "Because I knew, the moment you learned the truth, you would begin weighing every word, measuring every gesture, wondering what I truly wanted from you, rather than simply enjoying my company as you might enjoy anyone else's. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who see only my title, Eleanor, who calculate their every word around what they might gain from my favor. You were the first person in years who spoke to me as though I were simply a man, ordinary and flawed, and I could not bear the thought of losing that, even for a single conversation." Eleanor felt her anger wavering slightly beneath the raw sincerity in his voice, though the hurt remained sharp and present. "You could have told me from the beginning," she said, "before I had shared so much of myself, before I had allowed myself to believe in something that was, from the very start, built on a foundation I did not fully understand." "You are right," Alistair admitted quietly, taking a slow step closer, though he stopped when he saw her tense, respecting the distance she seemed to need. "I should have told you sooner. I convinced myself, day after day, that tomorrow would be the day I finally found the courage, and then tomorrow would arrive, and I would find myself once again, unwilling to risk losing the one honest connection I had found in years. It was selfish of me, Eleanor. I understand that now, seeing the hurt on your face tonight. I am deeply sorry for the pain this deception has caused you, even though every feeling behind it was entirely genuine." The garden fell quiet between them, the distant music from the ballroom drifting faintly on the night air, and Eleanor studied him carefully, in the dim lantern light, searching for whatever truth remained beneath the fine clothes, and the formal title, that now separated them so starkly from the simple man she had come to know on the moor. "Everyone in that room," she said finally, her voice quieter now, though no less pained, "will now know that the vicar's daughter has been walking the moor with the Duke himself, sharing confidences, perhaps even affections, without ever knowing the truth of who he was. Do you understand what that means for me? The whispers that will follow, the assumptions people will make about my motives, about whether I somehow knew all along and said nothing, hoping to secure some advantage from the connection." Alistair's expression crumpled slightly at this, the full weight of what his deception had cost her finally becoming clear to him. "I had not thought enough about how this would affect you," he admitted. "I was so consumed by my own fear of losing something precious that I failed to properly consider the position it would place you in, the assumptions people would make, the gossip you would now have to endure because of my cowardice." "Yes," Eleanor said simply, and the single word carried more weight than any lengthy accusation could have managed. They stood in silence for a long moment, the lanterns flickering gently in the night breeze, and Eleanor found herself studying his face, searching for the easy warmth she had come to know so well these past weeks, wondering if it had ever truly existed, or if it had simply been another careful performance from a man skilled, by necessity, in presenting whatever face the moment required. "I fell for you," Alistair said finally, breaking the silence, his voice quiet but steady. "Not for the vicar's daughter, who might make a suitable connection, not for anyone's opinion of what our acquaintance might mean politically or socially. I fell for the woman who let her small dog charge at my enormous wolfhound without a moment's hesitation, who spoke her mind freely without calculating how her words might affect my opinion of her, who listened to my confessions of loneliness without once trying to use them against me. That woman existed before you knew my title, Eleanor, and she exists still, whatever anger you feel toward me tonight." Eleanor felt her carefully maintained composure, wavering dangerously now, the hurt and anger tangling with something softer, something that ached at the sincerity in his voice, even as her pride demanded she remain firm in her indignation. "I need time," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly, despite her best efforts. "Time to understand what any of this truly means. Time away from the pressure of that ballroom, and the weight of your title, standing so suddenly between us. I cannot simply forgive this in a single conversation in a darkened garden, Alistair, however sincerely you may mean every word. I understand, Alistair said, though the disappointment in his voice was unmistakable. Take whatever time you need. I will not press you further tonight. But please know, Eleanor, that nothing about my feelings has changed, whatever you decide to do with this knowledge. Eleanor nodded once, unable to trust her voice further, and turned back toward the ballroom, needing to find her father, needing to escape this garden and this estate, and the overwhelming weight of everything the evening had revealed. She did not look back to see if Alistair remained standing there in the darkness, watching her go, though some part of her, traitorous and aching, wished desperately that he would. She found her father near the entrance hall, his expression immediately shifting to concern the moment he caught sight of her pale face. "Eleanor," he said softly, "what has happened?" "I will explain at home," she said, her voice tight with the effort of holding herself together. "Please, father, can we leave now?" Her father asked no further questions, simply gathering their coats and arranging for their carriage with quiet efficiency, and Eleanor kept her eyes fixed straight ahead as they made their way through the crowded hall, aware of curious glances following her every step, whispered conversations pausing as she passed, the entire room clearly already alive with speculation about the scene they had witnessed between herself and the Duke. The carriage ride home passed in near total silence, Eleanor staring out at the dark countryside rolling past, her mind replaying every moment of the evening, every word Alistair had spoken in that moonlit garden, every confession of loneliness and genuine affection, tangled together now with the sharp, unresolved hurt of having been deceived, however gently, for the entirety of their acquaintance. By the time they reached the cottage, Eleanor felt utterly exhausted, hollowed out by the emotional weight of the evening, and she allowed her father to guide her inside without protest, grateful when he asked no immediate questions, simply settling her by the fire with a cup of warm tea, while Pip curled anxiously against her feet, seeming to sense that something significant had shifted in his mistress's world that evening, something that would take considerable time and care to properly mend. The days following the ball settled over Eleanor like a heavy gray fog that refused to lift, no matter how much sunlight tried to break through it. She woke each morning with the same hollow ache in her chest, the memory of that glittering ballroom and Alistair's transformed appearance replaying itself endlessly in her mind, tangled together with the warmth of every conversation they had shared before that devastating revelation. She did not walk the moor that first morning after the ball, nor the second, nor the third. Pip, confused by the sudden change in their routine, took to sitting by the front door each morning, whining softly, and glancing back at her with an expression of such genuine bewilderment that Eleanor found it nearly as painful as her own turbulent emotions. "I know you miss him," she murmured to the little dog one particularly gray morning, kneeling down to stroke his soft ears. "I miss him too, whatever foolishness that admission might reveal about my own heart." The village, predictably, had erupted into a storm of gossip following the ball, every version of the story growing more elaborate with each retelling. Margaret arrived at the cottage the very next day, practically bursting with a combination of concern and barely restrained curiosity, eager to hear the full account directly from Eleanor, rather than relying on the increasingly fantastic rumors circulating through every household in the parish. "They are saying he proposed to you in the garden," Margaret reported, settling into her usual chair by the fire. "Others claim you refused him outright and stormed from the house in a fury. Mrs. Hargrove is convinced the entire courtship was some elaborate test of your character, designed by the Duke himself, to determine whether you loved him for his position or for his true self." "None of that is true," Eleanor said tiredly, though she found she lacked the energy to properly defend herself against the tide of village speculation. "He simply revealed his true identity, an identity he had concealed from me for the entire length of our acquaintance, and I found myself too hurt and too humiliated to remain at the ball a moment longer." Margaret's expression softened considerably at this more honest account. "Oh, Eleanor," she said gently, "I am so sorry. I know how much you had come to care for him, whatever name he chose to give himself." "That is precisely the trouble," Eleanor said, staring into the fire. "I cared for a man I believed to be ordinary in the sense that mattered most, a man without vast estates and inherited power standing between us, without an entire social order, dictating how we might properly interact. Now I do not know what to make of any of it. Was every conversation we shared somehow tainted by the fact that he held such power over me and over everyone in this village? Power he chose deliberately to conceal? Do you believe his feelings were false? Margaret asked carefully. Eleanor considered the question for a long moment before answering. No, she admitted finally. I do not believe that. Everything in his manner, every confession he offered me, felt entirely genuine at the time, and I do not think my judgment was so completely clouded as to have missed outright deception of that magnitude. But genuine feeling does not erase the fact that he withheld something so fundamental from me, something that changes the entire context of everything we shared. Perhaps, Margaret said gently, you might consider that a man raised the way he must have been raised, surrounded by people who valued him only for his title and his fortune, might have simply been terrified of losing the one honest connection he had found. That does not excuse the deception entirely, but it might explain it, at least. Eleanor had considered this very argument herself, turning it over endlessly during her sleepless nights, and she found she could not entirely dismiss its logic, even as her wounded pride continued to resist any easy forgiveness. Meanwhile, at the great estate beyond the hills, Alistair found himself equally consumed by misery, though his days were filled with none of the quiet domesticity that at least offered Eleanor some measure of comfort. Instead, he found himself surrounded by advisors and stewards eager to discuss matters of land management and tenant disputes, all of it feeling suddenly, painfully hollow, compared to the simple pleasure of a morning walk across the moor with someone who had cared nothing at all for his title. You seem distracted, Your Grace, his steward, a patient older man named Mr. Barrington, observed one afternoon, as Alistair stared blankly out the window of his study, rather than attending to the ledgers spread before him. I have made a considerable mistake, Alistair admitted, more openly than he usually allowed himself to speak with his staff. I concealed something important from someone whose good opinion had come to matter to me more than I properly understood, until I had already lost it. Mr. Barrington regarded him with the quiet wisdom of a man who had served the family for many decades, and had witnessed a great many personal struggles play out within these walls. If I may offer an observation, Your Grace, he said carefully, I have known you since you were a boy, and I have rarely, if ever, seen you speak with the kind of open warmth you displayed during those weeks when you disappeared each morning without explanation. Whatever mistake you believe you have made, the feeling behind it appeared entirely genuine to anyone paying close attention. That is precisely the trouble, Alistair said, echoing, without knowing it, the very words Eleanor had spoken to Margaret days earlier. The feeling was genuine, but I built it upon a foundation of concealment, and now I fear that foundation has crumbled entirely, taking everything else along with it. He did not attempt to force his way back into Eleanor's life in the days that followed, remembering his promise to give her whatever time she needed, though the restraint cost him more than he would have expected. Instead, he found himself walking the moor alone each morning, Boru trotting beside him, with none of his usual enthusiasm, seeming to sense his master's melancholy, occasionally pausing at the old stone bridge, as though hoping, against all reasonable expectation, that Pip and Eleanor might yet appear around the bend. It was during one such solitary walk, nearly a week after the ball, that Alistair conceived of a small gesture, modest and unassuming, that might communicate his continued devotion without pressuring Eleanor toward any decision before she felt ready to make one. He began, each morning, leaving a single wildflower at the gate of the Whitmore cottage, gathered from the very stretch of moor where they had first properly spoken, tucked simply into the iron latch where she would find it, upon opening the gate. He attached no note, no explanation, wanting the gesture itself to speak whatever truth needed speaking, a quiet acknowledgement of continued affection and patient apology that asked nothing of her in return. Eleanor discovered the first flower on a gray Tuesday morning, a simple purple heather blossom resting against the iron latch, and she stood staring at it for a long moment before understanding, with sudden certainty, exactly who had left it there, and precisely what it meant. She did not remove it immediately, letting it remain there through the morning, uncertain what response, if any, she wished to offer. The following morning, another flower appeared, different this time, a small white blossom she recognized from the patch of gorse near the old bridge, and the morning after that, another still, each one gathered, she realized with a growing ache in her chest, from some specific location along the path they had walked together so many times these past weeks. "He is trying to tell you something," her father observed gently one evening, having noticed the small collection of dried flowers Eleanor had begun keeping, almost against her own will, in a small dish upon her windowsill. "Without words, without pressure, simply reminding you, day after day, of everything you shared together, before all of this complexity intruded upon it." "I know what he is trying to tell me," Eleanor said softly. "I am simply not certain I know how to answer him yet." Her father regarded her with the patient understanding that had comforted her through every difficulty of her life thus far. "You do not need to know the answer today," he said gently. "But do not let pride alone keep you from a happiness that seemed, from everything you have told me, entirely genuine, before that unfortunate revelation complicated matters. Titles and positions are simply circumstances, my dear. They do not, by themselves, determine the true character of the man who holds them." Eleanor sat with her father's words for a long while that evening, watching the small collection of flowers on her windowsill catch the last light of the setting sun, and she found herself, for the first time since the ball, beginning to feel the sharp edges of her hurt softening slightly beneath the weight of everything else she knew to be true about the man who had left them there, one quiet gesture at a time, asking for nothing in return except the chance, someday, to be forgiven. 2 weeks passed in this quiet, unspoken rhythm, each morning bringing a new flower to the cottage gate, each evening finding Eleanor turning the small gesture over in her mind with growing tenderness, even as her pride continued its stubborn resistance to any swift resolution. She had not returned to the moor in all that time, choosing instead to walk Pip along the village lanes and the quieter paths nearer home, telling herself that she simply needed more time, though she suspected, in the honest hours before sleep claimed her each night, that she was also afraid of what she might feel should she encounter Alistair there again. Pip, however, had grown increasingly restless with this new arrangement, whining at the door each morning with an insistence that bordered on genuine distress, and Eleanor found herself wondering, with a small, sad smile, whether the little dog missed his large friend nearly as much as she missed the man who owned him. "You are being unreasonable," she told Pip, one particularly gray morning, as he sat by the door refusing to budge toward their usual village route. "The moor is not the only path available to us." Pip simply stared at her, with an expression of such profound canine disappointment that Eleanor felt her resolve wavering considerably. It was Margaret, arriving for her now regular visits to check on her friend's spirits, who finally spoke the plain truth that Eleanor had been circling around for 2 weeks without quite allowing herself to name it directly. "You are punishing yourself as much as him," Margaret observed one afternoon, watching Eleanor absently rearrange the dried flowers on her windowsill for perhaps the 10th time that week. "You have made your point, Eleanor. He understands the depth of the hurt he caused you. He has shown, through 2 weeks of patient, quiet gestures, that he respects your need for space and is willing to wait however long you require. At what point does continued distance stop being reasonable caution and start becoming simple stubbornness?" Eleanor set down the flower she had been holding and sighed, sinking into the chair by the window. "I am afraid," she admitted quietly, the honest words feeling strange and vulnerable as she spoke them aloud for the first time. "Afraid that if I return to him, I will be stepping into a world I do not understand, a world of titles and estates and social expectations I have never had to navigate before. What if I cannot manage it? What if I become simply another burden he must manage, alongside all his other considerable responsibilities?" "That does not sound like the confident woman who let her tiny dog charge at a wolfhound without a moment's hesitation," Margaret said gently, a small smile tugging at her lips. Eleanor laughed despite herself, the sound surprising her after so many days of heaviness. "Perhaps that confident woman has been somewhat shaken by recent events," she admitted. "Then perhaps it is time to find her again," Margaret said. "Whatever world he inhabits, Eleanor, you are the same woman who won his heart before he ever revealed his title to you. That woman does not disappear simply because the setting around her has changed. If he loved you honestly before, for exactly who you are, there is no reason to believe that love requires you to become someone else entirely in order to remain worthy of it." That evening, after Margaret had departed, Eleanor found herself once again seated across from her father in his study, the familiar comfort of the candle-lit room, offering her the space she needed to think through everything that had been building within her these past 2 weeks. "I have been thinking of returning to the moor," she said finally, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them, as her father read quietly by the fire. Her father set down his book with obvious interest, though he said nothing immediately, simply waiting for her to continue in his usual patient manner. "I do not know what I will say to him, if he is there," Eleanor continued. "I do not know if 2 weeks of quiet flowers has properly answered the hurt of that evening, or if I am simply tired of my own stubbornness, and afraid of continuing to punish us both for a mistake born. I think more of fear than of any true malice." "And which of those feels more true to you?" her father asked gently. Eleanor considered the question seriously, thinking back over every conversation she and Alistair had shared before that fateful ball. Every honest confession, every moment of genuine tenderness that had felt, at the time and even now in memory, entirely real and unforced. "I think," she said slowly, "that a man determined to deceive me for his own selfish purposes would not have spent 2 weeks leaving flowers at my gate, without ever once demanding I forgive him, without ever once pressuring me toward a resolution before I was ready to offer one. I think that speaks to a genuine respect for what I need, even as it also speaks to genuine regret for what he withheld." "That sounds like wisdom to me," her father said warmly, "though I would add only this, my dear. Love that survives an honest confrontation of its flaws, rather than simply pretending those flaws do not exist, is very often the strongest kind of love available to any of us. Perfect people do not require forgiveness, because they never make mistakes worth forgiving. It is the ordinary, flawed, genuinely trying people, the ones who err and then work patiently to make amends, who tend to build the most lasting affections." Eleanor left her father's study that night with a lightness in her chest she had not felt since before the ball, a growing certainty settling over her that whatever complications Alistair's true identity might bring into her life, the man beneath that identity remained the same person who had made her laugh on a foggy moor, who had confessed his loneliness with such raw honesty, who had, for 2 solid weeks now, respected her need for space without ever once abandoning his quiet, patient devotion. She slept better that night than she had in the 2 weeks since the ball, and when she woke the next morning, Pip was already waiting eagerly by the door, his tail wagging with an energy that suggested he too sensed that something important was about to change. Eleanor dressed quickly, pulling on her warmest cloak against the lingering chill of early spring, and as she reached for Pip's leash, she found her hands trembling slightly, though whether from nervousness or anticipation she could not entirely say. "Well, Pip," she said softly, kneeling down to look the little dog directly in his eager brown eyes, "shall we see if the moor still holds any surprises for us?" Pip's answering bark seemed to carry all the enthusiasm and certainty that Eleanor herself was still working to gather, and together they stepped out into the pale morning light, the gate creaking softly behind them as they set off toward the path that had, in the span of just a few short weeks, come to mean more to Eleanor than she had ever expected any stretch of familiar ground could mean. The mist hung low over the moor that morning, curling gently between the heather in soft gray ribbons, and Eleanor walked slowly along the familiar path, her heart beating faster with each step that brought her closer to the old stone bridge, where she had first properly spoken with Alistair all those weeks ago. Pip trotted eagerly ahead of her, nose pressed close to the ground, following some trail of scent that filled him with far more confidence than Eleanor currently felt in her own chest. She rounded the familiar bend near the churchyard wall, and there, exactly where she had somehow known he would be, stood Alistair, dressed once again in the same plain brown coat he had worn during their very first meeting. No fine tailoring, no formal trappings of his title, simply a man, standing quietly on a foggy path, with his enormous wolfhound resting calmly at his feet. He had not yet noticed her approach, his gaze fixed on the misty horizon with an expression of such quiet melancholy that Eleanor felt her heart ache at the sight of it. It was Pip who alerted him first, bounding ahead with a happy bark that startled Boru into raising his great head, and Alistair turned toward the sound with an expression that shifted, in the span of a single heartbeat, from surprise to something so raw and hopeful that Eleanor felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes. "Eleanor," he said, her name catching slightly in his throat as he said it, as though he could hardly believe she was truly standing there before him. "I believe this path belongs to everyone brave enough to walk it," Eleanor said softly, echoing words she had spoken to him weeks earlier. Words that felt, in this moment, like the beginning of something, rather than merely an old memory. Alistair took a careful step toward her, though he stopped short, clearly unwilling to presume too much after the silence of these past 2 weeks. "I did not expect to see you here," he said. "Though I confess I have hoped for it every single morning." "I know," Eleanor said, glancing down at Pip, who had already trotted over to greet Boru, with an enthusiasm that suggested the two dogs, at least, had never once doubted this reunion would eventually come to pass. "The flowers told me as much, even without any words attached to them." "I did not know what words would be adequate," Alistair admitted. "I thought perhaps silence, patient and unpressured, might say more than any explanation I could offer. I did not want to push you toward forgiveness before you were ready to offer it honestly." "That patience meant a great deal to me," Eleanor said, closing the remaining distance between them, until she stood close enough to see the hope and uncertainty still warring plainly across his face. "I have spent these past 2 weeks thinking of nothing else, working through my hurt and my pride, until I could see clearly what remained true beneath all of it." "And what did you find?" Alistair asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as though he feared speaking too loudly might somehow shatter whatever fragile hope had begun to rebuild between them. "I found," Eleanor said, "that the man who confessed his loneliness to me on this very path, who spoke of a childhood starved of ordinary affection, who laughed freely and walked slowly, simply because he wanted to prolong our conversation, that man was entirely real, whatever title he happened to carry alongside those honest confessions. I was angry, Alistair, and I had every right to be. But anger, I have come to understand, does not erase everything else that was true between us." Alistair reached for her hands then, and this time Eleanor did not pull away, letting him take them gently in his own, his thumbs brushing softly across her knuckles, as though reassuring himself that she was truly there, truly present, truly choosing to stand before him despite every complication his revelation had introduced into their acquaintance. "I am sorry," he said again, though the words carried a different weight now than they had in that darkened garden weeks earlier, softer somehow, less desperate, and more simply, honestly regretful. "I should have trusted you with the truth from the very beginning. I let my own fear of losing something precious convince me that concealment was somehow protective, when in truth, it only made the eventual hurt so much greater than it needed to be." "I understand your fear better than I did that night," Eleanor said. "I have had time to think of everything you told me, of a childhood surrounded by people who valued only your position, never your true self. I cannot promise that the world we now must navigate together will be simple or free of complication. Your position brings with it responsibilities and expectations I have never had to consider before. But I find, when I weigh all of that against the simple, honest happiness I felt walking this very path beside you these past weeks, that the complications feel entirely worth navigating." Alistair's expression broke then into a smile so full of relief and genuine joy that Eleanor felt her own heart lift in response, the last remaining shadows of hurt finally giving way to something warmer, something that felt, standing there on the misty moor with their two dogs sitting contentedly together nearby, remarkably like the beginning of exactly the kind of ordinary, honest happiness they had both been searching for all along. "I should tell you properly then," he said, still holding her hands gently in his own, "since I never managed to do so at the ball as I had intended. My full name is Alistair Grant Beaumont, and I hold the title of Duke, a position I did not choose but have carried since my father's passing some years ago. I tell you this now, not because the title matters more than anything else between us, but because I want there to be no more secrets standing in our way, however small or large they might seem." "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, "for finally trusting me with the whole truth. Though I must confess, Alistair Grant Beaumont, that I find myself still rather more fond of the plain man in the brown coat who let his enormous dog be thoroughly intimidated by my ridiculous little Pip on our very first meeting." Alistair laughed then, a real, unguarded laugh that seemed to chase away whatever lingering tension remained between them, and he reached up to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch warm and tender in the cool morning air. "That man has not disappeared, whatever grand title accompanies him," he said. "He is simply grateful, more grateful than words can properly express, for the chance to keep walking this path beside you, however many years the future might hold for us." "Then let us walk it together," Eleanor said, "starting this very morning, and every morning after, for as long as you will have me." "For as long as I live," Alistair said quietly, "I intend to have you beside me on every path worth walking." They continued along the familiar trail together then, hand in hand, while Pip and Boru trotted ahead of them, with the easy companionship of old friends, who had never once doubted this reunion would come to pass. The mist began to lift as the sun climbed higher over the distant hills, burning away the last traces of gray, to reveal the wide, endless stretch of moor, spreading out before them, in all its wild, untamed beauty. And Eleanor felt, walking beside the man who had once introduced himself simply as Alistair, and who now stood revealed as so much more, that she had finally found exactly the kind of honest, uncomplicated happiness she had spent her whole life quietly hoping might someday be possible. Pip, trotting proudly ahead with his small chest puffed out in the manner of a dog thoroughly satisfied with his own accomplishments, glanced back once at Eleanor and Alistair walking together, hand in hand, and gave a single, contented bark, as though acknowledging that whatever fierce battle he had once imagined himself waging against the enormous Wolfhound on that first foggy morning, the true outcome of their meeting had turned out to be something far better than any victory he could have envisioned, a friendship between two dogs that had, in its own small and unexpected way, brought together two people who might otherwise never have found their way to each other at all. And so, on the very same moor where a small lapdog had once growled fiercely at a stranger's enormous wolfhound, never knowing that the quiet, plainly dressed man holding the leash was in fact the Duke of the grand estate beyond the hills, Eleanor Whitmore found not only an unexpected friendship for her beloved Pip, but a genuine, lasting love of her own, built not upon title or fortune, but upon honest conversation, patient forgiveness, and the simple, enduring comfort of two people who had chosen, again and again, to walk the same path together, come mist or sunshine, come secrets revealed, or hearts finally, fully understood.